Why, hello, hello. It is I, recording this response at the glorious hours of 1 a.m. I have been pretty busy as of late getting my degree in geology and a minors in physics. That's right, I switched majors for anyone who actually pays attention to what I say in my prior videos. And today I will be responding to a 5-minute video by Leather Apron Club titled My Appearance on Joe Rogan. Now, for those who don't know who Leather Apron Club is, he's a philosophy YouTuber here on YouTube, and he's made such epic classics as Science is Philosophy, which it's not. Science is an empirical method of gathering data. You know, we didn't philosophize the creation of a car or the open heart surgery that might end up saving your eye's life at some point. No one sits down and thinks about that. That was all collected via empirical data and tested. That's what science is. One could suggest that science has a philosophical base to it, and I wouldn't deny that, but to suggest that all of science is philosophy is kind of foolish. But I digress. Leather Apron Club's problem in this video is going to be that he was apparently misrepresented on Joe Rogan's podcast. Now, that very well might be true. I will let you decide. You should go watch the Eric Weinstein podcast. It's Joe Rogan, episode 1945. But we're going to respond to more or less what he has to say about it versus the actual misrepresentation.
In the latest episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, the guest Eric Weinstein mentioned the name of my channel, and specifically mentioned my video on the levels of Jewish overrepresentation on Rogan's podcast. At first, I wasn't sure if I wanted to comment on this really, but frankly, I thought it was neat that I was just mentioned on Joe Rogan's show at all. Yeah, I was kind of a casual fan of his for a very long time, although I listen to him less now, but suffice it to say, I understand how big the show was, so it was cool. That and the fact that Weinstein described me in a pretty bad light, which displayed a real lack of intellectual honesty on the guy's part. Now, I don't really watch Weinstein, but I know enough about him to know that he sells himself as this impartial seeker of truth, willing to engage with even verboten subjects. He is a card-carrying member of the intellectual dark web, after all. So I was disappointed, if not very surprised, to hear him use my name to spread fear, rather than to engage honestly with what my research had brought to light. Here's the clip in question for context, and then I'll talk a little bit about each of the things that he says.
We're in an emergency situation, whether you can feel it or not. Like if you look at, there's a guy named, what is it? Oh, he's figured out Leather Apron Club, which is both the name for the junto that Benjamin Franklin established, which is something that we revere, and Leather Apron was the name for Jack the Ripper. So it's very clever, Martin Bailey, right? But he tracks, like, how many Jewish people does Joe Rogan have on his program? And
so right off the bat, Weinstein makes the silly accusation that my channel name, Leather Apron Club, has this hidden double sense. That it refers to both Benjamin Franklin's junto as well as a nickname for Jack the Ripper, and he likens this to a Mott and Bailey argument. I get the feeling that this was done to frame me, to both Rogan and to his listeners, as some sort of dark figure that would idolize a serial killer. To be clear, I had no idea before making the channel that Jack the Ripper had this nickname. I think that's pretty obscure knowledge to have anyhow. I learned about the Leather Apron Club, which is a philosophy club, from Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. And the majority of my videos, especially those that are on alternative tech platforms like Odyssey and BitChute, are to do with philosophy, so it's kind of a silly assumption to make anyhow. And by the way, if you Google Leather Apron Club, I can confirm that the first several hundred results contain no reference to Jack the Ripper. If you Google just Leather Apron, which I have never done before, it's several dozen results before Jack the Ripper is even mentioned. Who would frame a discussion about a person that they don't know like this? Especially...
No, I let that full thing play to give some total context, so that way I'm not taking him out of context. So his first complaint is that Eric Weinstein sort of mischaracterizes him by intentionally conflating him with Jack the Ripper, as like someone who secretly idolizes a serial killer, and he does this by showing Google results for Leather Apron. Now, I don't know whether or not this is just pure dishonesty, or if this is just poisoning the well. Why do I say this? Well, put simply, if we just simply go to our web browsers here, and never mind what I have opened for just a home screen here, and we just go to Jack the Ripper, and we click on his Wikipedia page, it is very easy to note that the leather apron monochrome is one of the first things that comes up on Jack the Ripper's Wikipedia page. Now, Leather Apron Club wants you to think that the idea of Jack the Ripper being associated with leather aprons is obscure, and I'll grant him that. It probably is obscure. The vast majority of people on planet Earth are likely not familiar with the moniker of Leather Apron. That's totally true. Most people probably know him by his Jack the Ripper title, per se. It was never really something that he actually called himself. I believe he called himself The Ripper. Or it might have been Jack the Ripper. For more information on Jack the Ripper, I'll put in the description a 1-hour documentary on Jack the Ripper by Lamino. It's very good. You should check it out. Warning, there's some disgusting descriptions of dead bodies and stuff, so if you're homophobic like me, that might not be your thing to jive with. But the point here is that Leather Apron Club tries to characterize this as Eric Weinstein trying to essentially poison the well against him. And he does this with Google results. Now, which one's more likely? The fact that Eric Weinstein, who is an educated theoretical physicist, decided to read the Jack the Ripper Wikipedia page and is well educated enough on philosophy to know what the Leather Apron Club is from Benjamin Franklin's side. And so he simply made a confusion that it's a Mott and Bailey. Or that Eric Weinstein saw Leather Apron Club's video talking about the number of Jewish guests on Joe Rogan and decided to find an Atlas Obscura reference to Jack the Ripper in order to make him seem worse than he actually is. To me, as another Jewish person who is a fan of Atlas Obscura knowledge, the first one seems infinitely more likely. It's likely Eric Weinstein is just simply making connections to pieces of knowledge that he knows. He's a scientist. That's what scientists typically do. So this characterization of Eric Weinstein is not only not fair, but it's Leather Apron Club jumping into the head of Eric Weinstein and pretending that he knows what he's thinking, or at the very least speculating on it, which to me is just dishonesty.
When all I did was publish publicly verifiable data. Next, he mentions that all that I did in my video was track how many Jews were on Rogan's podcast. Conveniently missing, though, from this description of my video are the results. So I'll let you know here that it was 42% of all of the political guests on Rogan's podcast that are ethnically Jewish. So that's not counting the athletes, the MMA guys, and the hunters that Rogan has on his show because, well, it turns out 0% of all of these guests were Jewish. So it would skew the results were I to include them with the rest of the population of guests. That was it.
Except that's not how statistics work. See, if you go to Leather Apron Club's YouTube channel right here, right now, and scroll down to the video in question, if you see how the episode's actually labeled, it labels a huge amount of people, Eric Weinstein being among them, and the title just says, nobody knows that half of Joe Rogan's guests have this in common. Now, I don't want to throw out any accusatory statements. I really don't. And in the video, he does specify politicians and scientists. That's absolutely true. The problem here is that the way the video is advertised doesn't say that. Literally does not say that. And even if that's what he means, I can prove beyond reasonable doubt that the perception is not even that. Furthermore, this is not how statistics are done. We don't remove data that's inconvenient to our goals or what we're trying to find. If I were to ask how many Jewish people appeared on Joe Rogan's podcast and you told me nearly half of them, that would be a lie, because when we factor back in all of the groups that Leather Apron Club does not factor in, even though the video implies, well, even though the video title implies otherwise, then the number goes down to about 20%. Now, to be true to Leather Apron Club's original point in the video, which was that Jews are an overrepresented group in Joe Rogan's podcast, which is a really weird thing to point out, in my opinion, not because of politics or anti-Semitism. Joe Rogan's the one who gets to decide who appears on the Joe Rogan's podcast. So, if anything, this is implicatory of Joe being philo-Semitic or just not caring whether or not they're Jewish. So, pointing this out seems to be pretty redundant to me. Nonetheless, it is true that Jews still have an overrepresentation, even if you factor back in all the groups that Leather Apron Club chose not to factor in his calculations in the first place. All I'm simply pointing out here is that factoring those groups out is dubious and makes the original data not usable, because you're literally not using the entirety of your data pool in order to come to a more valid, empirically viable conclusion. On a side note, I think it's pretty funny to accuse Eric Weinstein of being disingenuous with his leather apron monocle while blatantly advertising on his video, or at least the title again, that it half of Joe Rogan podcast guests and not, like, the actual number of all Joe Rogan podcast guests. To me, that seems like a double standard. If Eric Weinstein's not going to be allowed to get away with it, well, why should you?
Is there a reason that Weinstein didn't mention these results? It's hard to say. But that was the main takeaway of the video.
And here's where things get cynical, because while most people will sit down and not say anything, I will. I think Leather Apron Club here doesn't try and say anything because he doesn't want to lean either way, but either way, stating it's hard to say is dubious, as it directly implies that Eric Weinstein's trying to be dishonest. And this is weird because Eric Weinstein fully admits in the Joe Rogan podcast episode that Jews are overrepresented.
I was on your show years ago, and we asked this question about Jews in physics, and I made a joke of it. You said, like, why are there so many Jews in physics? And I said, well, I guess we're lucky at physics. I'm done with that, too. We have taken this language about underrepresentation into our souls through this diversity, equity, inclusion. And if you ask about underrepresentation, you have to ask about overrepresentation. And you know who's overrepresented? Jews. And now we're calling it the Jewish question. Why are there so many fucking Jews? Jews. Because we're fucking great at physics. And we're great at comedy.
So Eric Weinstein admits that this is real. But much like myself and much like many other people, we just sort of don't care about overrepresentation. Now, as a Jewish person, sure, that might be easy for me to say. And I can totally own that to anybody who wants to make that point. Just understand that to me personally, it's a particularly weak point. I don't care if black people overrepresent sports. I don't care if white people overrepresent whatever it is they overrepresent. And I don't care whether or not Asians are overrepresented in various areas. Overrepresentation to me is never a real argument. It's simply people trying to essentially dismantle what other groups of people tend to be good at. And they do so via nefarious means. If you were to ask me, all one need to do is look at the modern social justice movement and how it's really trying to tear apart white people on everything they do in order to see how just awful this mode of argumentation really is.
I think it's a little bit intellectually dishonest for him to not mention it. I mean, maybe it would undermine the point he was trying to make. But instead, he chose to paint me as some sort of schizo that was just counting Jewish guests for no reason. And as a supposed scientist,
We'll get to the reason, because I don't think you have a good reason. And I think that's why people like Eric Weinstein might think that way. Now, again, I'm skeptical as to whether or not he actually intentionally painted you as a schizo. Again, I think it's just infinitely more likely that he conflated 2 points of data that he knew that are indeed easily findable.
It's absurd for this guy to take this position. I quite literally observed a phenomenon, formed a hypothesis, and then gathered data to test that hypothesis. But we're not allowed to discuss the results because people like Weinstein say so.
Well, I don't think Weinstein said that you're not allowed to talk about that. If he did, he wouldn't have talked about it. No, you're absolutely allowed to talk about it. The question comes in with intent. What is the intent of pointing out the data? When I hear social justice warriors complain about white people being overrepresented, I always ask what the intent is. So it all matters as to what the intent is.
Because he says it indicates we are in, quote, an emergency situation. I really had hoped that instead of slandering my name...
I mean, that's entirely subjective, but I guess I'll ask it. Do you disagree that we're not in a bad state? Right now, here in the United States of America, people of different races are, in essence, at each other's throats. We are assaulting each other, attacking each other's successes over nothing more than our ethnic divides, and this is allowing the country to fall apart. People like you who point these statistics out with dubious intent, it's got to be put into question. Exactly how are we not in emergency mode? I would say that given the very bad connection between people of all races, not just Jewish people and whoever, be it white, black, again, race relationships here in this country are at an all-time low. Anybody with their finger on the pulse knows this, that we are in emergency mode. And attempting to point out statistical facts, which again, Jewish overrepresentation is a very real thing. I don't know why people who fight anti-Semitism try and deny it's a thing, or at the very least they try and downplay it. Certainly not I. But again, pointing out pieces of data and then not giving a concrete conclusion that isn't dubious puts your intent into question. It might make you part of the problem, and if it makes you part of the problem, then we're in emergency mode.
Weinstein would have taken the harder road, to acknowledge the facts before him and come to grips with the reality of the situation, opening the door to...
But as you say, the heart of the conclusion is that Jewish overrepresentation is resulting in Jews having a greater voice in our politics and science. Never mind the fact that science is sort of this whole non-ethnical thing. Like, Jews don't own science, even if they're the majority, and not all Jews agree politically. I mean, this is a dubious suggestion that Jews as a group do anything together. There are major blocks of Jews that will do things together, but there are major blocks of any ethnic group that'll do anything together. The idea that Jews alone do this is, again, a dubious claim. Moreover, let's assume that Eric Weinstein even agreed to that. Let's assume that Eric Weinstein just had a massive brain moment. What's he supposed to do? Stop studying theoretical physics? Is he supposed to give his position up to someone else who's less qualified than him? Ridiculous. The reality of it is that the people who point this stuff out, again, whether it be white people, Jews, or any other group, don't have any real solutions because frequently, at least what I find, a solution is not what they're looking for.
We have an intellectually honest conversation about those subjects which we should most desperately want to do so with, those that are verboten and taboo.
Well, I would say that would start by representing the data correctly. Instead of saying half of Joe Rogan's guests, it's more or less 20%, which is still valid to the point of overrepresentation, but again, you claim that skews your data, even though that's not how concrete data works.
Defender of free speech, he seems curiously unwilling to allow mine. But is he even a defender of free speech? I mean, he always says he is, so I guess ostensibly. But he says not 2 minutes after mentioning my name that we should either limit free speech legally or have free speech but with social penalties.
You have two choices in a society like this. You can either try to control what people think and what they say, or you can have a cultural penalty for saying something that is horrible. And I want us to have free speech with a cultural penalty for these things, as opposed to having to regulate what you can and cannot say.
But depending on the nature of the social penalty, are these two tangibly different at all? If
The answer is yes. The answer is yes. These are two different things. See, the government owes you free speech. In theory, the government cannot take your free speech away, and if it does, that's a genuine problem. No one in the government is taking away the free speech of the people who are getting deplatformed. YouTube does not work for the government. Twitter does not work for the government. Most of these social media platforms, in fact, all of them, do not work for the government. Instead, they have what we would call a terms of service. Now, the terms of service is a thing that you agree to when you make an account. And when you sign that terms of service, it's got a list of things that you can't do. Companies do not owe you free speech. The government owes you free speech. Companies do not work for the government. Therefore, if you use a social media platform and you break their terms of service, they do not have to acquiesce to the transient rights that we all have, because their platform is those rights for all intensive purposes. No company can, like, owe you a house unless they're a construction company. Okay, I'll keep this in the video. That's a bad example. No company in, say, the tech industry can guarantee you the fundamental rights as stated in the United States Constitution. It's not like if Twitter says no guns on the Twitter facility where Elon Musk works, I guess. I don't even know where the hell it is at this point. That's not a breach of the Second Amendment, because that's private property. The Twitter execs get to determine, or is it just Elon Musk at this point? Oh, that's so confusing. Whoever runs Twitter gets to decide what's on the premise of their own building. That's part of the whole freedom gig. So these are definitely two different things.
If it's merely legal to discuss Jewish overrepresentation, yet you will lose your business, have the contents of your bank account stolen, and be transformed into a social pariah by the media, what matter is a legal penalty.
Now, he flashes these images of Kanye West while saying this, and this is where I turned my brain off. At no other point when I was watching this video initially did I not take him seriously, but this is where I turned my brain off. Kanye West went live on Alex Jones, said that he loved Hitler, and then proceeded to talk to a bottle of milk and a fishnet. Kanye West went on actual huge anti-Semitic rants. Now, whether or not there is a moral issue where someone can face financial issues, I think is something worth discussing, believe it or not. I'm not sure that the banks actually have a right to be political, and since the banks control our monetary values, maybe they shouldn't. But the problem here is that you are equating Eric Weinstein misrepresenting you, which again, dubious claim, with Kanye West's actual unironic anti-Semitic rants. And it's not like you, where it's subjective, that the person in theory could view you as being anti-Semitic. And for the record, I don't think Leather Apron Club is anti-Semitic. I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. I just think that he's doing this for reasons that can come off as dubious, and therefore the point doesn't really land the way he wants it to land. The point I'm trying to get here is that what happened to Kanye West and what happened with Eric Weinstein and you are so far apart that they are not even remotely comparable. The social media platforms that Kanye West was using had every single right to get rid of him because he had violated their terms of service. And as I've already stated, social media companies do not owe you free speech on their platform that you use. It's part of the terms of service that you signed. Now, again, there could be some debate about whether or not companies should even have a terms of service that limits your speech. Sure, I'd be more than willing to have that debate too. I don't know where I would even fall on that position. I'm a little iffy on it. If I created my own platform and say an anti-Semite was using it, I would just get rid of them. So maybe I lean in pro terms of service, and Leather Apron Club simply lands on anti terms of service. Nonetheless, they exist here in today's world now, and trying to appeal to governmental rights as a sort of workaround intellectually for that is, again, dishonest. I mean, you tell me, how many dishonest representations of the facts am I supposed to give someone who is upset that someone else was supposedly dishonest about him? It just comes off as incredibly hypocritical to me.
People to have free speech, but he is also clearly okay with silencing dissident voices.
Eric Weinstein hasn't silenced anyone. In fact, he literally talked about you. That is the antithesis of being silenced. Eric Weinstein himself has been on the receiving end of being silenced. He gets called a pseudoscientist by his peers all the time. He's been deplatformed before. Like, this bizarre... And it's an evolution of an accusation, right? Because Eric Weinstein hasn't deplatformed anyone, and he didn't advocate for anyone to be deplatformed. He said he wants free speech with social consequences. So, in other words, if I go into town square and I say, I hate black people, boy, that'll be funny for anyone to clip in the future, then I should be able to face the social repercussions of my own actions. And this is something that has really started to bother me from people on the right. And before I continue, yes, I'm aware that I am calling Leather Apron Club right-wing, even though I can't confirm that. And if he wants to message me and state that he's not right-wing, that he's actually this or that, I'd be more than happy to put a little thing down below in the description to say I was wrong about that. You get these people like Kanye West, or let's actually remove Kanye. He's a special case. You get these people like, say, Mike Enoch, Nick Fuentes, what's one of these other losers? Who's that guy who ran for senator? Patrick Little, who think that free speech is so transient to the fact that nothing will happen to them if they say horrible things. That's not what free speech is. Free speech is your right to say just about anything you want. It says nothing about facing social repercussions. And that's the problem here. You, like them, want to be able to say whatever you want while facing no social repercussions. That is never how society has ever worked, even before free speech. And so, why should it work that way now? I'm very much in favor of free speech. I'm very pro-free will. I'm very big on people having a choice. But I also firmly believe that your actions have consequences. And if you're unwilling to accept that your actions have consequences, then to me, you're not a mature adult. Mature adults are capable of talking about their ideas without complaining about the social problems that might come up when they say it. We can talk about proportionality, sure, but if you've deeply entrenched yourself into social media, like say you've got a Twitch, a Twitter, a YouTube, and then you start spreading anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, well then, after violating all of those terms of services, you can expect some big-time social repercussions. And if you don't want that, your alternatives is to go to alternative social media sites, which I'm starting to make alternative social media site channels. I just made a Rumble. So even I will retreat to these locations. Or You can verbosify what you're going to say in such a way that it doesn't violate the terms of service. Now, I can't guarantee that that will mean that you won't get treated badly. Very recently, the Lotus Eaters podcast actually got demonetized with little to no warning, and it wasn't exactly clear what they had violated. So there definitely is a political aspect of people who are silencing people who technically don't violate the terms of service. But notice how Leather Apron Club doesn't actually say that. No, instead it's some sort of dubious, overreaching idea that we need to silence people. No one has been silenced. They have been removed from platforms that just so happen to be the biggest platform because those terms of services state beyond reason that you cannot do X, Y, and Z. In particular, in YouTube, there might be some sort of vagueness there that YouTube likes to operate in, but the general premise is you can't do X, Y, and Z.
Dissident voices, so long as this silencing is being done by a private company and not the government, as if this distinction has a difference.
I mean, I already went over this, but there is a difference. YouTube does not work for the government. Twitter does not work for the government. I'll never really understand this idea of pretending that these things work for the government when they don't. These are tech companies that have their start as... I mean, like, Amazon started in Jeff Bezos' basement. You think the government commissioned Amazon? That's ridiculous. Of course not. The government didn't mandate YouTube or ask for the creation of Twitter, and they didn't fund those companies either because they're not related to the government. They're global social media platforms. So, I can't help but think that this is just blatant double standards, that Leather Apron Club gets upset when Eric Weinstein mischaracterizes him, but then he mischaracterizes the situation of free speech on social media platforms. But he also does such very irresponsibly. If we go back to that Jewish statement with Joe Rogan, in reality, it's 20%, but half of Joe Rogan's guests of science and politics are Jewish. Okay. 1 second. Well, all it really takes me to do to find someone who is mischaracterizing that in a way that Leather Apron Club doesn't is right here. Just scroll down and you'll find, like, a comment. You're telling me that 40% of Rogan's guests are Jewish? Well, again, it's not 40%, it's 20%. And he doesn't bother to make the science or politics distinction. So, I guess my criticism here is that Leather Apron Club seems to want to have his cake and eat it too. He wants to be able to point out these statistics, but he doesn't want anyone to point out what that might entail, or why he's doing it, or the potential social repercussions. At the same time, I'm sure that someone from his audience, if they ever see this video, is going to say, well, Josh, you're Jewish, therefore your defense against this is invalid, which would completely undermine the whole argument that, you know, oh, I'm not pointing them out just because they're Jewish. I don't know. I don't exist in Leather Apron's Club's mind or his heart, and I don't know where those two things are at. For all I know, he could be a genuinely meaningful person who is just not articulating what he wants to articulate with proper definitions, or he's got some kooky philosophy that I just don't agree with. But as someone who tries their hardest to be objective, and for clarity, I'm not objective. No one on planet Earth is objective. So, to call out myself, the idea of me being objective is a dubious statement. But I try my hardest. I try my hardest to account for the information when it's there, and I hold people accountable for their actions. I've literally killed my friendships over this. So when I see Leather Apron Club get upset about a supposed mischaracterization, But then he sort of mischaracterizes the data and then mischaracterizes free speech on social media and then conflates that with how the government is supposed to give us free speech. I can't help but see that this is a blatant double standard, and it's just, I'm not sold. I'm not buying what you're selling until you can actually present it without having that double standard, because double standards are fallacious, and fallacious information is about as useful as the rocks outside my house.
All in all, it was disappointing to see that we're still unwilling to stand for those rights which we ought to hold most dearly. That we can override what our founding fathers held to be God-given rights if we deem a particular subject too far beyond the pale. Yet
I don't think that's what's really going on. Again, most people who point out this demographic stuff tend to do so for dubious reasons, and we have a very long, presentable history of that happening. It's the idea that, like, you know, oh, this Leather Apron Club guy, we've got to silence him, which might be a over-dramatization on my part, but, I mean, he's acting like a drama queen here. This is essentially begging the question. His preconceived ideas as to how free speech function are baked into how he acts, and therefore we are shocked when they don't work that way. I, for one, like to check to see what the rules actually are before I do something, so I can't say that I'd ever do that, but who knows, maybe I would. I mean, I've been known to be wrong before.
it is subjects exactly like this one, which we need most desperately to discuss frankly and honestly, rather than relegating them to darkness where they are allowed to fester and worsen. Mr. Rogan...
Important subjects that need be festered and worsened. So, how am I supposed to characterize that? If the context is that Weinstein's talking about Jewish overrepresentation, then the conclusion is that Jewish overrepresentation is a problem. And this is why I talked about intent earlier. Exactly why would that be a problem? Are you implying that Jews as a group would skew the science, the demonstrable science, in order to change things in their favor? Or the politics? Because, of course, suggesting that all Jews exist on the same political scale, that would be ridiculous. That would be ignorant. That would be something only a buffoon would think, yeah? So since it clearly can't be that, exactly what's the actual problem here? Unless it is that. In which case, it really is anti-Semitism. In which case, there really is going to be social consequences for that statement. Yeah? Again, I'm not going to accuse Leather Apron Club of being anti-Semitic. I don't know what's going through his head. I'd be very curious to hear exactly what these problems of Jewish overrepresentation would be. And if he's not actually talking about that, if he's talking about the transient idea of problems that can't be talked about, which, given how inconsistent you've been in this video, I'm not buying it. But if I'm wrong, come and tell me. I'll be more than willing to change what I've said. Then really, I think that this is not worth the effort. And this is why I chose to respond to this video rather than his actual video talking about the Joe Rogan video, because not much can really get done with the Joe Rogan video. The only thing worth note is that he sort of poisons the well against accusations of anti-Semitism at the beginning of the video, which I think positions people into being defensive. I call a spade, a racist's a racist, an anti-Semite's an anti-Semite, a Nazi's a Nazi, and a social justice warrior is a social justice warrior. It makes no difference to me.
If you truly care about seeking truth, then be willing to talk about these things, rather than letting people like Mr. Weinstein silence the discussion.
If you truly care about these things, I need to be able to talk about the dubious relationship of Jews and overrepresentation without giving any real reason as to why it's important or why that would be a bad thing. Again, unless we go to actual anti-Semitic reasons. And for clarity, I would defend white people, black people, Asians, all the same. No ethnic group acts as a monolith. You might find certain cultural trends, because that's what a culture is, but there is no such thing as a political monolith within any ethnic group, because political divides are one of the things that has sort of driven human history. The Greeks, very famously, did not agree on anything from city to city. And the Roman Senate was very famously a complete and total shit show. So, this notion that, like, you know, ethnic groups are all samey, if I'm characterizing this correctly, assumedly, again, this is a dubious claim, and so no one should be taking it seriously to begin with. So why should it be platformed?
And I will note, if you want somebody to talk about them with, I will be more than willing to come on your show.
And just like all people who talk about Joe Rogan and something that they don't like or want to platform, please invite me onto your show, Joe. I'd be more than happy to talk about it. Personally, after Joe Rogan platformed Bright Insight and Ben from the Uncharted X channel, it's left a really sour taste in my mouth. For those people who don't know who those guys are, they're non-experts. Neither of them have a degree in the subject of Egyptology. Who like to suggest that, well, it's not entirely clear what they suggest. You want to know what? This is a little off topic. We'll get to them in a different video. Point is that I'm not entirely sure the Joe Rogan podcast is the pinnacle of definitive information. And that's going to be the end of this response video. It's new, it's different. You get to see my face full blown. And it's about politics, which is sort of new for me, because normally I'm talking about God and theology. I want to do both. I want to do both. I want to talk about politics. I want to talk about God. I want to talk about a whole bunch of stuff, really. And so, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Tell me if you want to see more. If you don't like it, tell me why. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you think I'm doing this wrong, and that Leather Apron Club is an innocent man with no dubious claims whatsoever. And with that, shalom.